Greetings and welcome, everyone. I'm Allison Schilling, the Senior Program Officer here at the Concord Museum. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's forum with Dr. Elise Lemire on her newest book, Battle Green Vietnam, the 1971 March on Concord, Lexington, and Boston. Dr. Lemire is well known in Concord for her book, Black Walden, Slavery and Its Aftermath in Concord, Massachusetts, which brings to life the experiences of enslaved and free Black families in 18th and 19th century Concord, as well as tells the larger story of slavery throughout New England. Concord has played an outsized role during pivotal moments of our nation's history, from the embattled farmers who fired the shot heard round the world to being the birthplace of American letters, where in the 19th century, Henry David Thoreau spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days living deliberately on the shore of Walden Pond. Today, Dr. Lemire is sharing another pivotal moment in our nation's story that starts in Concord. On Memorial Day weekend in 1971, more than 200 Vietnam veterans marched the Battle Road from the North Bridge through Lexington Green before gathering on the Boston Common, where their supporters and onlookers, about 3,000 people in all, protested the war from which they had recently returned. Dr. Lemire tells this extraordinary story of what became the largest mass arrest in Massachusetts history through the perspectives of 6 people who played central roles in the events. We're lucky enough to be joined today with one of the figures, Bester Cram, who was one of the organizers of the famous march and camped out in the field adjacent to the North Bridge in Concord, and was later arrested on Lexington Green. Our moderator this evening is Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane Executive Director of the Concord Museum. As always, we thank everyone who has tuned in to watch the program. If you wish to submit a question, please do so in the chat on YouTube, and I'll relay those to our speakers. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Thanks, Allison, and Elise and Bester. It is a privilege to be with you. I look forward to the conversation. And Elise, I really enjoyed the book. I read it closely over the weekend, and just such a fascinating story in its own right. And then we'll talk in a minute about kind of the way you frame it in terms of protests of place. And I thought actually we might start there. And if you don't mind, I'll quote a little bit from the book and then hand it to you just to kind of give us the brief overview. But you write about how the in this protest, the American anti-war Vietnam veterans grabbed and held the national spotlight by mobilizing 2 powerful tools, place and performance. And as Allison said, the protest was in the spirit of our revolutionary forebears, and you compare it to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which also captured the attention of both the British and their fellow colonists. And just again, to give a little bit of background, spring of 1971, it's in the aftermath of the news of what has come to be known as the My Lai massacre and other atrocities. And this contingent of anti-war Vietnam veterans, led by Bester and others, drew on both place and performance by organizing this march from Concord to Boston, those sacred sites where their forefathers had laid down their lives for the cause of freedom. So maybe you can just tell us what drew you to the subject of the book, and tell us a little bit about the research and writing of it.
Well, first of all, Tom, thank you so much for having me tonight, and to Allison for organizing, and for the Concord Museum for hosting, and a big thank you to Bester Cram for joining us. As Allison mentioned, I wrote a book about the history of slavery and its aftermath in Concord, Massachusetts. So when I had finished that in about 2010, I was thinking a lot about memorialization practices in Concord, because of course, if we all think about the famous Daniel Chester French Minuteman statue at the Old North Bridge, we know that some of these memorial statues assert the idea that all of the farmers were self-sufficient, that they were all white. And my book makes very clear that the wealthiest farmers were enslavers in Concord for 150 years. So I'm really interested in memorialization and the stories that memorialization tells us. And it was at about that time that I really literally stumbled upon an image a photograph by the very renowned Massachusetts photographer Ted Pollenbaum, who's from my hometown of Lincoln, Massachusetts. It's a photograph that appears in an NEH-sponsored it's called masshistory.org, I think. It's a website about Massachusetts history. And it's a picture of a veteran in a fatigue shirt with a boonie hat on, and his arms are raised in the air, and he's flashing a peace sign. And the caption told me he was on the Lexington battle green. And I immediately knew I was going to write a book about this, and that, sounds strange, but immediately I said, I have to understand what this is about, because I thought I understood memorialization practices in Concord and Lexington, but when you see a real soldier on a memorialized battlefield, whatever myths or origin stories those memorials are telling you, all of a sudden tell a very different story. So if the Minuteman statue, just to take that for an example, is telling you that Americans are only violent reluctantly. I mean, if you know that statue, the farmer has picked up his musket, but his hand is lingering on his plow because he wants to return to his fields. This soldier, I didn't know who it was at the time, was making very clear that I could no longer think of Americans as defined by their reluctance to be violent. I could no longer think of Americans as always anti-imperialist, which is another important story told at the Old North Bridge and on the Lexington Battle Green. So I just started to research, and I first went to the museum, which is of course in Washington, DC, and they have all of Ted Pollenbaum's photographs. One I saw very early on was of a Vietnam veteran who marched with Bester and who had been grievously wounded. So he's in a wheelchair, and all of a sudden there's this picture of him in front of this, these Minutemen statues. There's one in Concord, there's one in Lexington. So there was another myth that these veterans were immediately exploding, right? This idea that American soldiers are inviolate, they can't be injured. And now all of a sudden I had to admit to myself that war is a contest of mutual injury, as Harvard philosopher Elaine Scarry tells us, Elaine Scarry. So I was intrigued, and I wanted to write a book about memorialization practices, looking at the memorialized landscape through the eyes of Vietnam veterans. But I didn't want to tell it from 10,000 feet. I wanted to know who that man was, and I've since met him, and he's a dear friend of Bester's. His name is Lenny Rotman. I met other veterans because Bester and Lenny and all of them are still friends, and they were very kindly put me in touch with each other. So I wanted to tell it in a kind of novelistic way so that you're on the ground with them as they're repurposing these memorialized spaces.
And we're going to kind of walk through those days, but in Bester, we don't have enough time to have you tell the whole story, but maybe we need to know a little bit about your decision to enlist in the Marines, your experience briefly in Vietnam, and then your getting involved in this, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Maybe you can just give us that thumbnail sketch.
It'll be a thumbnail for sure. But I just wanted to say that I respect so much what Elise has achieved in terms of the way in which she has made us think more deeply about the past and its relationship to the way in which we conduct our lives today. And in some respects, if I was to tell you sort of the brief way in which this got me engaged, I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps as an officer. I enlisted in 1966. I was released in 1970 at the convenience of the military after I had submitted a conscientious objector reclassification application, having served 13 months in Vietnam and having come back as a decorated officer, serving in I Corps as an engineer. My experience was one where it was an accumulation of knowledge and emotional responses to what I found us engaged in. And in some respects, it was knowledge and emotional responses that got me there to begin with. I was wanting and willing to fulfill my patriotic duty. And I saw actually, when I finally realized what a misguided adventure that had been and the lies that had misinformed me, I then continued to feel like it was my patriotic duty to both protest and then be a part of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So when we came together as a group, we had already spent a good part of the earlier part of the year in various different forms of protest as an organization, most significantly down on the Washington Mall, where we spent a week prior to the May Day events during the last week of April, in which we participated in a variety of different really activist engagements with lawmakers and with the public, trying to inform a willing and open public to the notion that this war could no longer continue, that it was illegal and immoral, and there was no justice to be achieved at all. Very similar to things we're talking about today. The action that was put together for the walk march from Concord through Lexington to Charleston and ending up 3 days at Boston Common, in a sense, was formed as a continuation of what we, as Vietnam veterans against the war, saw as the rallying cry that we could offer at a time in which the peace movement was fractured. The peace movement was, in some respects, almost hungry for a new voice to enter into the cry to end this war. We had been misled again by a presidential campaign in which Richard Nixon had been running as a peace candidate, hard to believe. And the war continued. The bombing continued. Henry Kissinger and Nixon and a variety of different allies continued to misdirect the way in which we were going to find ourselves leaving that particular part of the world and, quote, in their minds, return with honor. So after Dewey Canyon, we felt like the place to continue the energy that had been achieved and the national attention that had been achieved, and essentially the credibility that had been achieved by Vietnam Veterans Against the War in its protests in Washington. We thought it was perfect to essentially do a ride in reverse, utilizing the historical notion of a warning cry that Paul Revere had and others had offered to a community that was prepared to resist. And we felt that our community was prepared to resist if we could offer that warning cry.
These are both your words and Elise's, that the veterans would march the route in reverse to underscore the point that the United States needed to reverse its course in Vietnam. But Elise, another lovely quote of yours, and important is, especially when we get to Lexington, and again, we will go in a moment, location by location, but kind of the sacred nature of these spaces. And you write that the march was both highly unusual and breathtakingly creative, but also dangerous insofar as many local officials and a good number of their constituents were incensed at the veterans' unorthodox use of Revolutionary War battlefields. The Old North Bridge, you write, exists in the eternal. It's fixed in time, fixed in the time of the sacred. So talk about how that notion of these sacred spaces ends up kind of becoming the kind of a crucial, the kind of conflict that will unfold over the next couple of days.
Well, first I want to explain that the Vietnam veterans were the first veterans in American history to come home and protest the war in which they had served. And I think because of that, they were at risk of being considered traitorous. So it was, and Buster will correct anything I say that's wrong, just jump in, but they worked hard to establish the idea that their dissent was patriotic, a continuation of their service in the military. So Buster mentioned their occupation of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. 6 weeks before his chapter, the New England chapter, march from Concord to Boston, but it's also worth mentioning the fall before that Bester had participated in a march from Morristown, New Jersey to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, an over 80-mile march, which I believe was conducted in 3, possibly 4 days. But VVAW's idea, really starting the fall before, was to establish their patriotism by going to sacred sites and establishing their sense of identification with our founding fathers, our forebears, to be less gendered about it. But so Morristown, New Jersey, and Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, these of course are the 2 most difficult encampment sites that the Continental Army ever faced. So in standing on that sacred ground, the veterans were saying, we are not, as Thomas Paine said, sunshine patriots, we're winter soldiers, which is of course a term that VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, used to describe a set of hearings they had the winter before the veterans came to Concord. So the use of sacred space, particularly of Revolutionary War memorialized battlefields, was a way to say we are soldiers and we are patriots. And in standing up to our country, we are still patriots. And the other piece of it, of course, is that when you go to a memorialized battle site in Massachusetts in particular, having to do with the Revolutionary War, these are places where memorial practices are intended to make time stand still. You walk onto the North Bridge and you don't see a telephone pole. You don't see anything modern. There's a restroom, but it's tucked behind some trees. You are meant to be transported back to 1775. And clearly the landscape looks different because it's been memorialized, but the veterans wanted to re-release that foundational energy. And I think it was the reason it's so brilliant, of course, is that it's on the eve of the bicentennial. Americans are starting to participate in historical reenactment of Revolutionary War battles. And all of a sudden, it's not just veterans making this march from Concord to Boston, they are joined by civilians. I don't know of any other VVAW event where that has happened. By the time the veterans are occupying the Lexington battle green, there are 1,000 people on what is a tiny 2.5-acre plot of land. So the sacred nature of these sites has to do with re-releasing foundational energy, but Concord, okay with that. Lexington, not so much.
Yeah, I was partly surprised, Bester. I'm interested. Your requests both to the Park Service and to the Selectmen in Concord, it's fairly uneventful and you're given permission to camp out. But before we go there, you did get an angry and anonymous call, I think a day or 2 beforehand. Maybe just relay that to kind of heighten there is tension, but maybe relay what happened in that call.
We had been pretty visible to the local community in Boston in terms of some of the different activities that we have been involved in. And so there was an effort on our part to actually be good publicists about what we were doing. And we let people know that we were coming to essentially rally what we felt was a silent majority in the suburbs to join us in Boston, where there was a very friendly, essentially, group of people that would be joining us on the Common. But I got a phone call on I think it was the Thursday night before our arrival on Friday in Concord from an anonymous individual who just said, bullets to greet you. It was I would say, a very startling call. I had not anticipated such a reaction from somebody. It was clearly somebody that was angry and somebody who essentially instilled in me a sense that they meant business. My reaction was a great deal of fear, understanding that we were in a situation where not everybody was welcoming us to come into their neighborhood.
And talk for a minute, Bester, as you're about to begin the march, the process of how you and your peers, your colleagues, made decisions was important to you. Tell us, the manner in which, as you faced, especially in Lexington, how you processed those things and why that was so important.
Well, I think you're suggesting a pretty complex question here. In some respects, the leadership of the New England chapter of VVAW was essentially an officer leadership. Those of us who were sort of running the show were officers. And we were very well aware of the fact that the command structure that had existed when we were in the military was something we did not want to replicate in terms of the way in which we were acting in organizing and becoming activists in the community. So there was an additional emphasis amongst all of us to ensure that there was a very vivid, very visible, it's really the word I wanted to use, expression of democracy. As long, very slow, very deliberate, very inefficient in terms of getting things done, but we had time, and in a sense, we were in a territory that was unknown to us because we had no idea who was coming to support us. And as Elisa suggested, the ranks swelled not only both in terms of the number of veterans who came to join us, much the same way as the Minutemen came out of the hills and the farms from communities all around. We had people coming from Rhode Island and from Connecticut and actually from New Hampshire as well, joining us in Massachusetts. But we also had townspeople from many different communities, so that the ranks swelled to over 1,000. And we still wanted to ensure that there was an experience of democratic participation, directing the way in which we were going to make our decisions as we were going forward. There was a script that only existed for the beginning and the end of our march. The rest of it was unscripted and in some respects needed to be re-scripted or reinterpreted along the way, hour by hour, sort of day by day. And that's what happened. We would gather and we would discuss how things had evolved, what situations we were faced with, and whether or not everybody in the community was comfortable with the risks that were involved. It was also an opportunity for us to hear the varieties of different ways in which people were thinking the protest was occurring, what they felt about it, and there was room for dissent and disagreement about how we should move forward. Generally speaking, by the time we get to the moment in which we were faced with actually breaking the law, so to speak, as nonviolent, conscientious protesters, the degree to which we found support was almost unanimous. Not completely, but generally speaking, there was a great groundswell of support. And I have to say, just the final part of this answer is that amongst veterans, that's the group that I'm most able to speak for. We did not agree on a lot of things. We didn't agree on why we'd gone in the military. We didn't agree on why we'd gotten out. We didn't agree upon how the war had been conducted or how it should be ended. But we did agree that we as Vietnam veterans were opposed to the war and the way in which it was being handled at this particular time, and that we needed to end our involvement in Southeast Asia. And that was the one unifying manner that that kept us together. From that came an agreement of nonviolence. And that was to be true throughout the entire 4 days of our march. 3 nights of encampment and 4 days of movement. But that was, that was expressed at the beginning, but wasn't necessarily expected always. But there was no indication that there was going to be anything other than a nonviolent participation amongst all the veterans.
So this often happens. We don't have time to do justice to the full story, which is why people should get a book and read the whole book. But let's just kind of wrap up Concord by saying it does go somewhat according to script. and able to stay at the park, which I'd be curious today. I don't think they would allow it today, but it was allowed then. But Elise, why don't you, not to defend or say it was right or wrong, but explain now the position of the select men at the time, the select board in Lexington, especially the chair. What position do they take when this permit comes to them about the veterans being able to camp out on the Lexington Green?
Well, for anyone who's tuned in who's not from New England, what is a select board? They used to be called select men. It's the equivalent of a town council. So what you need to know about this march is that the National Park Service was leasing and continues to lease and will lease for perpetuity the Old North Bridge area. So that is part of the 1959 park, Minuteman National Historical Park. And NPS had clearly followed what had happened in DC, and they knew that the federal government had a lot of bad publicity for trying to oust the veterans from their encampment on the National Mall. So they weren't about to repeat that situation. So no one ever gets permission to camp at the Old North Bridge. But I think the National Park Service had learned that men who have served their country are an exception. And so they allowed them to stay. And also the Concord Select Board and the Concord Police allowed the veterans to perform guerrilla theater, which we haven't talked about yet, but I believe we have a slide of that, so we can talk about that later. But the Lexington Battle Green is not part of Minuteman National Historical Park for reasons we won't go into, but it is controlled by a 1923 bylaw that gives the Select Board the authority and indeed the responsibility to make sure that any activities on the green are appropriate for a sacred birth spot, if you will, right? I mean, there was no return of fire at the Lexington Battle Green, but that's the first time that a colonial militia was fired upon. So it is considered a sacred American birth spot. And the select board took, I'm gonna use select board now because that's the modern term, but the select men, the select board took seriously their role of keeping that space set to that sacred birth time, that eternal birth time of 1775, so that anyone visiting it can return to that sacred moment and be rebirthed as an American, right? So that's essentially what's supposed to happen. But as much as the select board back in 1971 talked about their fear of litter, their fear there would be alcohol and drugs, their fear that the guerrilla theater would give someone a heart attack, it is true that the chairman was a Nixon supporter. That's certainly a factor. But yeah, the select board did not want the veterans there, probably because they did take seriously their role, which I can respect. I mean, most recently, they did not allow the Oath Keepers to gather on the Lexington Green. And we probably would all agree, given what happened on January 6th, that that was a good idea. So they do take that role seriously. The point here that's really, for me, critically important is that the Vietnam veterans did come, as Vester said, as an anti-violent group. Vester was trained in peaceable protest and volunteer in Connecticut. So they were going to break the law. They were going to break a minor law. But theorists of civil disobedience will tell you that if you are breaking a minor law for a higher moral cause or a higher moral reason, and you're doing it peaceably, and you're willing to pay the price of going to jail, of paying whatever fines or whatever other punishments there are, that is a morally sanctioned act. It's a very Thoreauvian thing to do, to just invoke another son of Concord, Massachusetts. So the select board, just a couple other things here, not only didn't want the veterans on the green, they did everything they could to keep them off the green, including filling out paperwork in advance in Middlesex District Court that the veterans had been disorderly. Before they even arrived, they were deciding they were disorderly. They obtained an injunction that would allow them to arrest the veterans, not just fine them, right, for disobeying this bylaw, but allow them to arrest them. They cleared the town garage so that they had a makeshift jail where they could conduct a mass arrest and put hundreds of people. They called all of their police officers in. They called police in from 2 neighboring towns. They called the state police in. So they took very seriously their role as the guardians of this sacred space. And in contradistinction to that, of course, you have the veterans who are acting according to a higher moral law than this 1923 bylaw.
So again, we're rushing through the story, but it leads to what is known as the largest mass arrest in the state's history. And what I was struck by, Bester, was it happened at 2 a.m. They could have just gone to bed, and you all would have marched on the next morning. And but it also reminded me, student of the 1960s, that Martin Luther King almost wanted Bull Connor to do what he did because that brought attention to Birmingham. Were you hoping that they would make this decision? I mean, you didn't, as you said, you didn't know, like it wasn't scripted, but just, I don't know, just take us, and did you think at midnight, they're not going to do it, and we're going to have our, you've given your speeches, and you're there on the green, and they haven't chosen to arrest anyway? Just walk us through, and then what actually happened, when they give the order at 2 a.m. and how that unfolded.
Well, truth be told, we actually gave the selectmen an out before we arrived in Lexington. And we suggested, give us a place where we can spend the night. And they denied that. So after having denied that, and after having, essentially taken an opportunity to be welcoming to us, I think that changed sort of the nature in which we began to feel like, okay, we have some leverage here ourselves. Let's move forward. But frankly, Tom, I think we were hoping, by the time we got to midnight, we were hoping they would do the arrest because it was to our advantage, for sure. The optics of it were going to be to our advantage, but the national interest in this was going to be elevated. I think they waited until 2 because there were so many townspeople there that they wanted to at least, reduce the number. They knew they weren't going to get rid of the veterans, but they wanted to reduce the number of townspeople that left. And so as it turned out, many of the townspeople who wanted to actually be arrested with the veterans missed out on that opportunity. And in fact, I think it got to a point that after the 400 plus number of people have been arrested, they had to just sort of tell other people there, we're not going to arrest you. We just don't have the ability to transport you and move you through the various different systems that we've got to move through. So there was, we had overwhelmed them. I think that it was a moment of so-called victory, not in a conflict sense of victory, but in a sense of we had made the moral victory very apparent to whoever was watching. And at the same time, it also, as Elise very well has sort of described the uniqueness of this, it wasn't just veterans getting arrested, it was townspeople getting arrested, it was young kids getting arrested, it was old folks getting arrested. It was a bonding of a whole group of people who had come together for a common purpose. And I think that provided essentially the recognition that, probably we weren't going to sleep that night. We would stay up all night until we did get arrested. But I wasn't convinced it was going to happen. But
right.
I'm in hindsight, I'm thankful that it did.
And obviously both sides thankful that it really did remain peaceful, that you had counseled your colleagues and peers who followed that counsel to get arrested peacefully, and the police officers in turn. And there was almost a mutual respect in Elise's book, that those police officers were just doing their job the way you had been doing in Vietnam, and that they were following the orders that they had gotten from their chief. Elise, this might be a good moment for you to talk about the role of townspeople, and especially the women of Concord and Lincoln and Lexington, who played kind of a support role. Maybe you can comment on that, and then we'll go to some photos.
I don't think we can understate the amount of work that goes into pulling off a march with hundreds of people that takes you through multiple jurisdictions over multiple days, right? I mean, we're talking almost 20 miles, but they're going through various towns. Everyone needs to have a place to sleep, everyone needs to have food, and everyone needs a place to use the bathroom. So the amount of preparatory work that goes into this is intense. Christopher Gregory, one of Buster's friends and VVAW colleagues, has told me they came into the office early in the morning, they left late at night. It was a lot of work that went into this. And what's interesting to me as someone who grew up in Lincoln is that so many local women wanted to help and did help. And I think this has to do with the fact that second wave feminism is just coming to the suburbs of Boston. And there was a way in which the women really identified with the veterans, whether that was appropriate or not. But that sense of they were victims of the federal government, they were starting to realize they were victims of something as well. But at any rate, for example-
And there were gold mothers there as well.
Yes, and one of them is on this call, and I have a slide and want to make sure that we do talk about Patricia Simon, who's on the call tonight, and unfortunately we're not in person, but I do want to definitely talk about her. But just to say that VVAW is being supported by MASS PACs and CPACs, and I won't go into the acronyms, but these are civilian peace groups. And Betty Levin was married to someone who was working very hard on behalf of peace on the civilian side. And when she heard the veterans were coming, she was just one of many women who sort of leapt to her feet and said, what can I do to help? So it's Betty Levin who goes with the veterans to the National Park Service office in Minuteman National Historical Park. It's Betty who puts them in touch with people who help. I know Vietnam veteran Don Carico is in charge of the food, but he has to work with local people. These are mostly women who are making spaghetti for the veterans and doing all sorts of things. I mean, even down to when the veterans got arrested, Betty Levin said to herself, you know what, I can't get arrested because someone's got to call the company to come empty the porta potties. And it's these kinds of things that people have to do. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of coordination. And some of the people who helped are women I know. So that was really wonderful for me to know. So in Lincoln, if anyone's here from Lincoln, Margaret Flint Sr., there's also a Margaret Flint Jr., her son was in Vietnam, but her daughter was against the war. So to honor both of those views, she came and sat with the veterans on the green after helping prepare food for them. So a lot of this is going on. And what really struck me was how many veterans told me what that meant to them. Because at least the veterans I talked to have told me that often people didn't ask them about their experiences, didn't really want to know what had happened over there, what they were being asked to do. And so to have this kind of outpouring of support in the form of food and welcome and, breaking the law with you, I think for a lot of veterans, Buster, you'll again correct me here, but I think that was very meaningful because it was a kind of public acknowledgement of the pain and anger that people had about the war that they weren't getting really from a larger segment of the public. So a lot of work was happening to pull this off. And again, just to talk about the peaceable nature of it, this would be such a different conversation if the veterans hadn't made sure that everyone stayed calm. I mean, people were angry and frustrated. And when you're reenacting search and destroy missions, it's easy to flash back and maybe get a little too into the moment. And for things could have turned badly so easily. So yeah, with hindsight, we're talking about what a peaceable event it was, but I think that's just really to the veterans' credit that, in light of what had just happened in Chicago, for example, this happened because so many people were behind the veterans because the veterans were so on top of all of the logistics. And as Bester said, there was a script for the beginning, there was a script for the end, but what has impressed me to no end is the fact that they started off as so many Paul Revere's. When the Lexington selectmen said, no, you can't come to the battle green, they said, we're going to stand as the Minutemen stood. So now they've changed the symbol they're mobilizing. Then when they commit to civil disobedience, now they're standing as Thoreau stood. Doing guerrilla theater, they're taking on the role of the British. So they're constantly sort of shape-shifting and grabbing different symbols and mobilizing them as the situation changes. So a lot really goes into this, which is why I called it really a breathtakingly creative protest.
So like the way you described this, but I would add on to, we call it a march. There was also a parade about it. And a
Yeah.
parade sort of is where you get feedback back and forth, where those who are parading give something to those that are watching, and those who are watching give something back. And there's clearly that kind of exchange taking place as well.
I mean, this is why in history, so many of the most successful protests are multi-day protests, right? I mean, the march in Alabama or Gandhi's Salt March, because you have a chance to be seen by so many different people and to get feedback and interaction with so many different communities.
We're going to switch now to show some slides. There's a little bit of humor in the script. I'll just mention as we make this transition that when arrested, a number of the veterans would give names like John Parker or Sam Adams, or and list their birth dates as April 19th, 1775. And we should just note that in essence, the fine was $5. I mean, there was an arrest and then fine, and then the veterans were released to continue with the march. And we're going to talk about Charlestown and Boston in a moment. But Elise, go back to the, yeah. Why don't we start here, Elise? You can tell us. We see three faces of Bester Cram on this on our screen at the moment. But
I wanted to jump in about the fine because, of course, this is a Concord Museum event, and say that the people of Concord paid the fines for the veterans.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they were, and we'll see a picture of one of the women who helped VVAW collecting that money so that the veterans didn't have to pay the fine themselves. I chose these pictures because I think it's so important to understand that people went through this incredible transformation, right? From having the kind of short hair their dads did and the short hair required of them of the military, and then rejecting that and embracing a kind of hippie aesthetic, if you will, which carries the message of love and peace. So here's a picture of Bester, who has grown out his hair and has a beard. This is a beautiful photograph supplied by Vietnam veteran against the war, Rand Martin. So thank you to Rand for supplying this. And Bester, that's you with your wife, Penny, on the left.
That's right. We're still competing to see who can have the longest hair.
So even as, you might think this is a fashion choice, it's so much more than that. And I will say, when the public first saw veterans protesting the war in DC, which was the first time they grabbed the national spotlight, it became clear to people that this was a combination of aesthetics that had never been seen before, because the veterans protested in fatigues. So they've got the long hair that says love and peace with the hippies. They've got the fatigues of soldiers, and this is a new model of masculinity the country had not seen before. And when we get to a later slide and we talk about Patricia Simon, who does live in Concord now, she talks about this new masculine aesthetic as being life-saving. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I have another slide here of Bester, the next slide of Bester's compatriot, if you will. This is Ross Fenton, who was the coordinator of the Rhode Island chapter. And Bester and Arthur, who were the co-coordinators of the New England chapter, did invite the Connecticut and Rhode Island chapter to come, and they did. But one, because they found the idea so compelling, reversing Paul Revere's ride. And in coming, they add more people, they add more veterans and give even more heft to this. But this is just another wonderful set of photos that shows the changing sense of who they were between when they went to Vietnam and when they came home. And these are just, again, two really fabulous images. And in the third one, you can see, if Allison doesn't mind advancing, you can see them again and again. You can see Bester here, and then that is Arthur Johnson. I can't point, obviously, but with the macrame belt, I'll put it. That's so Bester's wearing his U.S. Marine Corps shirt, right? So it's long hair, peace and love, but it's, I'm a soldier, and if you want to know what's going on in Vietnam, talk to me, because I've been there. And so then you see Arthur, who sadly has recently passed away, but very much Bester's co-inventor of this march. And then there's Ross Fenton again, who come up as the chapter leader from Rhode Island. And then on the far right is Don Carrico, who I mentioned was in charge of the food, really, with other people, but also working with the local women on that. And then I think in the next slide, I wanted to say just something about how VVAW embraced theater as a way of not telling people about the war, but showing them and making them feel it emotionally. So I talked about guerrilla theater. The Concord selectmen said, sure. And so the veterans on Saturday morning performed a mock search and destroy mission in Concord's Monument Square. So imagine you're out walking about doing your shopping, and all of a sudden, these men carrying very real looking toy M16s rush onto the square and start taking prisoners, interrogating them, and then pretending to kill them. This is in fact not in Concord. This particular picture, again, it's Bester kneeling on the right, is guerrilla theater in Boston. I think it's in the Public Garden here. And this is maybe 5 or 6 days before they went to DC to kind of raise awareness. This doesn't make the front page of the news, right? Again, it's when they go to DC, that's when VVAW gains the national spotlight. And that's why I think the New England chapter came home and said, we have to keep the spotlight. And that's why we're going to reverse Paul Revere's ride. And then the next slide also speaks to theater, protest theater, having props that make clear that these are soldiers. These are real soldiers. They know what they're doing. They know what they're talking about when they talk about what's going on in Vietnam. And this is Peter Wilson driving his family's Land Rover, happened to be olive drab. He took the roof off, took the doors off. Now it looks like a military Jeep. So this is in downtown Boston, but this pulls into Concord the morning of the march's commencement. And what the veterans are going for here is for civilians to say, wow, this is what the Vietnamese must feel like. And I just want to take a moment to say that while VVAW may seem like it was not the most radical group insofar as they're embracing patriotism as the core of their essence, it's a very cosmopolitan group. It's not just we care about ourselves, it's we care about the Vietnamese. So in performing guerrilla theater, what they're asking you to do is, how would you feel if you're just sitting at home and some other country invades your country and you don't have any say in it? The next thing you know, you're shot dead. So these kinds of props were very, very powerful. And then I think in the next slide, I wanted to just show the veterans using the memorialized landscape. This picture, Bester really orchestrated this because the veterans have mobilized on the side of the bridge with the Minuteman statue, and they're about to commence the march. And Bester, if I can just speak for you for a second, sends the press to the other side of the bridge so that they get a shot of the marchers coming towards them. And what VVAW always did, with the wounded's permission, that's really important, was put them first. Because this is more theater, but I don't mean that in a light way. This is serious theater. This is, look what this war has done to us. The guy who was the Minuteman statue is based on an Acton militiaman who was shot in the heart, but we don't celebrate that. That's awful. The statue shows him as if he's going to live forever, but that's not really what happens in war. So this image ran on the cover of the Boston Globe that weekend above the fold. Very, very powerful image. And you can see right on the left side, a young woman giving this veteran flowers. And one of the things they did that weekend were the lilacs were in bloom and they decorated themselves with flowers. So they very much embraced flower power. And then in the next slide is just another photograph. And I think the reason there's so many photographs of this march, there's also just tons of film footage, is people were absolutely captivated by what the veterans were doing. So lots and lots of photos. Again, you see the leaders of the march they're the wounded. And I think in the next picture, I did want to show some of the women. I don't have a picture of Betty Levin, who I mentioned, but this is her daughter who sadly passed away of cancer way too early. One of Betty's idea was, like, if you're going to reverse Paul Revere's ride, you need someone to play Revere. And her daughter was already a reenactor, as you can see from her tricorn hat. So I just wanted to, again, just the number of people who got involved, and Jennifer Levin, just a teenager, but very much against the war and very pleased to be able to help. And in the next image, I thought, Bester, maybe you could say a little bit about Jean Rubenstein.
Well, Jean has sadly passed as well, but she was, in a sense, a spirit leader for VVAW and for all of us in the New England chapter. She worked at Mass Packs and provided kind of a backbone of organization, but also of compelling a sense of, be on the front lines and speak truth to power. A marvelous woman with a great sense of what the price for justice is that one needs to pay. I think, we all learned from her immensely.
And here she is collecting money from Concord residents to pay your fee. So it's an amazing photograph right there as well. And then the last photo, I believe, the next slide, Allison, I don't have a really nice picture to share with you of Patricia Simon. I do believe she's on the call. She did not live in Concord at the time. She does live in Concord now. She allows me to talk about her story. So I want to share with you that sadly her son David was killed in Vietnam within, I think it's 3 weeks of arriving there. But she told me that when he was 19, he felt he needed to go to prove his manhood. And this is a story you hear over and over again. After basic training, he knew the war was immoral and wrong, and he wanted to go AWOL. And his mother talked to some people, and they said, hey, your son wants to be a teacher. Probably not a good idea. He's going to have to go. So he went, and she subsequently talked to another man in his unit who thinks her son just stood up in the middle of a firefight because he didn't want to kill anyone. And that is a really hard story to share. So, sorry, that's just, that really gets me. But at any rate, later, when she heard about VVAW, she realized that if her son had had the support of the guys in VVAW, some of whom, like Bester, were initially working with LISP, the Legal In-Service Project, that helped GIs figure out how to get out and knew the law and knew what was possible, that if she had had that kind of, and she said it to me, masculine support, right? This new ideal of masculinity, she thinks it would have saved his life. So she goes with VVAW to DC. She lays wreaths at Arlington National Cemetery with the veterans, not just for the Americans, but for the Vietnamese. Then when it comes time to march from Concord to Boston, she says, I'll speak. And she spoke at Boston Common, and she has devoted her life to being an advocate for peace. Anyway, this is a photo taken on the Lexington Battle Green. Some of the women in town made this poster. Of course, again, a Gold Star mother is a woman who's lost a child in the military. And all the women signed it. So yeah, I wanted to be sure to mention her as a Concord resident who lent such incredible support to the veterans, and I think gave them even more legitimacy because they were standing with the Gold Star parent.
Thank you, Lisa.
Oh, sorry, and I had one more slide, I forgot. I just wanted to give everyone a sense of scale. And because the press followed the arrests, right? And it was on the cover of all the newspapers for 4 days running, at least 3,000 people came to the Boston Common to welcome them. And maybe I just have time to say the performance aspect of the protest continued with a ceremony during which the veterans broke into fragments their very real looking toy M16s, and the crowd bore silent witness to that. And that was really, and then there were some speeches, of course, but that was really the close of it. And look how many people came.
You know, at least you're so good about helping us understand sort of the meaning of a lot of events that took place, both then as well as 150 years before then. And it's one of the accomplishments of your book and your research. You've actually, you always astound me because you remind me of things that I never really think we thought about as deeply as you have. But the fact was that, we were all in an arena where we wanted to take the ambiguity away from the world we lived in. We may have not been certain about a lot of things. We may have not understood each other, but when it came to this war, I think that, what we all recognized was there was an opportunity here for people to recognize that the experience that we as veterans had made us credible as storytellers ourselves, and that it was giving permission to others to say, okay, I am no longer going to be ambiguous about this war. I'm going to take a stand.
sadly, we are running out of time. Elise, I thought I might close by asking you, I'm going to ask Bester the contemporary question, but we should remind everyone that you're a professor of literature, not history. And you talk about, there's admirable things about Longfellow's poem in that he is trying to inspire kind of his generation as the Civil War is approaching. He's an abolitionist. So these lines, for born of the night wind of the past, through our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will awaken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. But you remind us there's no violence in that poem. There's no killing in that poem. And what the veterans do in this march is remind us of, as you just did with that very powerful story of a mother losing her son. Just maybe tell us a little bit. You write about it so eloquently in the book.
Well, Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, is one of the most popular American poems, in part because for generations, people were asked to memorize it. It's very easily memorizable. It has a lot of end rhymes and has a really nice meter that happens to sound a lot like a horse. So it's really popular, but it's mostly popular, I think, because it's a story about American creativity and American bravery and American alacrity, right? So how did we win the American Revolution? Well, we came up with this brilliant semaphore system, one if by land, two if by sea, and we bravely rode a horse really fast from Charleston to Lexington. And what Longfellow does is he essentially leaves the violence to basically two lines in the poem where he says, you know the rest in the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled. He does not want to talk about violence. He asks at the beginning of the poem, he says, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April. So he wants you to remember the creativity of a Paul Revere, not the violence of April 19th. And I think when the veterans took that as their script, it was a great move, because what it did was immediately everyone knew where they were going, right? Because everyone knows the poem and they knew exactly what towns they were going to go to. Everyone loves the poem because of its celebration of creativity and alacrity. But what the veterans end up doing, of course, is in an ironic twist, if you will, is they end up taking the script and deconstructing it, showing us what it leaves out, what it glosses over. And I think that's probably the big takeaway for me about the march is the mobilization of symbols, but at the same time, they have to kind of break these symbols open and show us that they're just symbols, they're just myths, and really war is not something to be glossed over. Because it's left all of these young men unable to return to civilian life until they ensure that this war is over.
Bester, I'm going to give the last word for you, someone who served our country honorably, and bring us to the present moment. We study history partly to illuminate our present. And before we went on air, you were commenting a little bit about what you are thinking about when you see what's unfolding in Afghanistan. And one of you share whatever you would like to as our final word, and then I'll come back and close us out.
Well, I think I turn to Elise, and a good deal of the work she does is to demystify our history, recognizing that myths have so often misguided us. And we live in a time right now where there is a myth of nation building and a myth of our capacity to be able to make a change in the world. And the way in which we conduct it oftentimes is clouded by misguided and disinformed actions that end up becoming myths about how we handle things. We look at today and what is taking place in Kabul, and we think of Saigon. We should think also that a 20-year war in Afghanistan was not that different from a 12-year or 15-year, or however you want to count the numbers of years that we spent in Vietnam. So in some respects, our review of history and re-review of the myths that have misguided us in terms of how we think about history seems to be essential. Longfellow's poem is a myth. It's a beautiful poem that celebrates so much about who we want to be as Americans, and yet it can leave so much out that helps us get through the hard parts of our history that we actually shouldn't forget.
Thank you. I thought I would end with a poem that Elise includes in her book by Archibald MacLeish. It's just an excerpt. It's called "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They say, we were young, we have died, remember us. They say our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them. They say whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us." Elise Lemire, Bester Cram, thank you very much for this thoughtful evening conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Bester.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Elise.